The most interesting class that I took when I was a fellow at Harvard was a course taught by the former dean, Harvey Cox, on religious biography. We studied the lives of Walter Rauschenbusch, Dorothy Day, Martin Luther King Jr., Trungpa Rinpoche, and Philip and Daniel Berrigan. It was especially meaningful because Harvey Cox had personally known, worked with, and taught with all of them except for Walter Rauschenbusch. So every day in class, we were thrilled both by the stories of the lives of people who had changed the world, but also by literally being able to touch history through the stories that Harvey Cox would tell us. The side stories about a bourbon-infused pillow fight with Martin Luther King, and on and on. I have movies about most of these people, and some of them are really, really good. Honestly, if you've never watched the movie Entertaining Angels, that's about the life of Dorothy Day, I encourage you to do yourself a favor and watch it right away. It's really good. But I find that when I have a house guest and we decide that it's going to be a movie night, that I almost never pull out one of those historical films. I defer to one of my fictional heroes rather than my historical heroes. I never get tired of sharing my love of the mysterious Guy Fawkes character. V is for Vendetta, or the self-sacrificing exorcist Constantine. And there is Gandalf from Lord of the Rings. There's Albus Dumbledore of Harry Potter fame. And though I'm not necessarily proud to admit it, I have shed tears watching a Marvel Comics movie. Iron Man died. That was hard to take. All I'm saying is that while we can draw important moral lessons from studying the biographies of world-changing historical characters, that there is also a lot to be learned about character, about morality, about making decisions in hard times, that we can learn from art and literature, whether the stories are about fictional or fantasy characters. Because, folks, the Bible itself, I don't want to shock anybody here, but the Bible is full of stories about fictional characters. There's a lot of people in the pages of the Bible that just never existed. We have pretty good reason to believe that Jesus and Paul were actual historical characters, and based on Paul's firsthand accounts, we can also be fairly sure that there was a Peter, James, and a John. But guys, 12? I mean, who picks 12 friends? These are obviously a tip of the hat to the 12 tribes of Israel. And Judas wasn't a person. If you've never heard that before, find it difficult to believe just because I said it, let me quote directly our good friend Bishop John Shelby Spong, who wrote, "Judas was a totally fictional character, totally fictional literary character created by the early Christian church in the 9th decade for the sole purpose of shifting blame from Jesus' death away from the Romans, who were certainly responsible for it, and placing the blame on the backs of the Jews." Now, this is my copy of the Jewish historian Josephus's work, and it is over 1,000 pages. It's over 1,100 pages of little tiny type. And just to let you know, this looks like a nice new book, but this is my third copy, which is a testimony to my misspent years as a graduate student. But I digress. The Gospels are about 20 or 30 pages long each, so they were not attempts at writing history. Josephus was writing at about the same time that the New Testament was being written. People of that culture and that time knew how to write a history book. They knew how to make it a comprehensive thing. The gospel writers were not interested in writing a comprehensive history of the life of Jesus. Our gospels are religious stories that are meant to convey about the same thing as a sermon. They may be loosely based on historical events, but the writers were not trying to record history. They were, and I don't think you can say this strongly enough, they were trying to influence your thinking. They were after your heart. Mark invented the passion narrative. Matthew, Luke, and John copied his basic outline and list of characters. The early church had a vested interest in blaming the Jews for the death of Jesus rather than Rome, because they didn't want Rome to snuff out the early church in the way that they were trying to snuff out the Jews of that time. But historically speaking, Jesus actually was a Jew who was executed by the Roman state on a Roman cross under the charge of sedition. I'm not saying that the Jews didn't throw Jesus under the bus. They may have. But what is clear from the early church's writing is that they were throwing the Jews under the bus, and neither one of them has anything to be proud of in that. My preaching professor at Vanderbilt, Dr. David Buttrick, used to admonish us, your people don't come to church to hear a history lesson. I heard him say that over and over. And yet almost all of our classes in seminary were history lessons. So they filled our heads with history, and I don't think it's the fault of young preachers that when you wind them up and set them loose on the church, that they end up giving a lot of history lessons, because that's mostly what they told us, isn't it? It took me a long time to really appreciate what David Buttrick was trying to say to us. But when preachers open their Bibles in church and start to read, they are implicitly inviting their congregation to come away with me, join me in leaving the real world and the here and the now, and let's go back to those dusty old roads of ancient Palestine. Buttrick insisted that when you are doing that, you're pushing preaching off into an imaginary world where it has no power, it has no impact on the here and the now. And for evidence of that fact, we need only consider what I mentioned last week. We are a nation full of people, the majority of whom still identify themselves as Christians, that is currently holding tens of thousands of children in cages where they are being traumatized, sleeping on concrete floors, deprived of any contact with their parents. They don't know where their parents are, and their parents don't know where they are, and yet churches all over America today read for the common lectionary this story about Nicodemus. And so churches that are Catholic, that are Protestant, that are Methodist, Episcopalian, are all talking about Nicodemus. And I don't mind telling you, Nicodemus isn't real. It's a fictional character. There never was a Nicodemus, but there are tens of thousands of children in cages. But Nicodemus was invented by the author of John's Gospel, whoever that was, intending to make Jews look kind of shallow and stupid. This wouldn't make me mad if they used the story of Nicodemus to help people wake up to current events, but I wonder, of the hundreds of thousands of sermons that will be delivered today, how many of them will ever get out of the first century to think about global climate change, to consider how our military budget is consuming the resources that we need to offer universal health care, higher education, and a living wage. How many churches move out of that secret dark night talk with Jesus to think about our drone policy or our wall along the southern border, or for that matter, the wall we're helping to finance between Palestine and Israel? The Gospel of John was written in the early 2nd century. In terms of its own setting, it appears to have been written by the church in Rome to contradict the popular influence of Marcion. I could say more, but I realize that you've got more important things to think about. None of that is especially relevant to us beyond simply accepting the fact that this is not history. Nothing in John should be taken as an eyewitness account of actual events. It's a religious story intended to keep the church on the right track. And I'm not telling you that to make you mad or to make you feel like you've been lied to or to make you tear the Gospel of John out of your Bible. I'm just saying, if you read it to find out what happened, that's as bad as watching Fox News to find out what happened. It's 99% spin. And so what we really should be asking John is, what is your point? What is it you are? They're not trying to tell us history. So what are you trying to tell us? So if I can get you to come along with me on this quest, let's take a look at John as John, the way he's presenting the material, and see what he's saying to us. And to do that, I think you've got to kind of draw the wide-angle lens back a bit. John pairs two stories for the purpose of contrast. Nicodemus is a leader among the Jews, but he sneaks around at night to talk to Jesus because somehow he just inherently knows that his religious faith is somehow inadequate, and he is struggling to figure out, how do I hold on to my position of prominence and influence while questioning what gave me a position and influence? But then John places the story next to the story of the Samaritan woman at the well, whom he portrays as being a kind of slutty, heretical Jew. I'll expect some email this week from people who are enraged that I showed all three of these characters as white Europeans in ancient Palestine. Those letters will, of course, come from people who did not hear me just say they are all fictional characters. But welcome to my world. Without going into the historical nuances of conflicts between Jews and Samaritans, or getting lost in the moral codes of marriage and interactions between men and women in the first century, let's just try to see this in something of the way that John was trying to show it to us. Let's say that Jesus one night gets a visit from Gandhi, and the next morning he has a conversation with Paris Hilton. And the surprise ending is that Gandhi just doesn't get it. And yet Paris Hilton turns her entire life around and becomes something that is at least an approximation of a decent human being, which would be a far stretch for her. But you know, these things happen in fictional stories, right? John is saying, in coupling these stories, that not everyone gets Jesus. And the people who don't are oftentimes blocked by a lifetime of religious indoctrination. And I can tell you, as a guy that taught Drury's course in the life and teachings of Jesus, I oftentimes had Muslim students in my class who had never read the New Testament and only vaguely had heard of Jesus. They just had to get 3 hours of credit to get their degree at Drury. And they seemed to understand the Gospels better than my people who had grown up in church being indoctrinated in all the wrong things. In fact, I think one of the only F's I gave on a paper was to a student whose father was one of the disciple pastors in town. And she said, "My dad helped me write that." And I said, "Your dad should take my course next semester." I don't know why I'm not more popular with them. But the point of putting these two stories together is a lot of people just don't get Jesus, and it's their religion that keeps them from getting it. It's their indoctrination. It's what they think they know. It's what they're sure of. And the people who do receive it are oftentimes so broken. Their lives are just so fractured that there's an opportunity to get things in. Crisis, you understand, is also opportunity. That's that old saw about the Chinese character for crisis is a combination of the characters of danger and opportunity. That when your life is in crisis is when you have a chance to recreate it. Now, in real life, I suspect that Gandhi would have had a very deep and meaningful conversation with Jesus, and Paris Hilton probably would have blown the whole thing off with a Valley Girl whatever. But just let the story seep in the way John tells it. It isn't about real people, it isn't about real history, but it is about human potential. Whether you are reading a biography or a fiction, the real issue is to see how the story affects you, how you react to the story. Beyond the politics of the early church, John is dramatically setting two characters against one another for contrast. The one you would expect to win doesn't even get off the starting block, and the one that doesn't seem to have a chance is the one who becomes the hero of the story. The story, as many good redemption stories do, runs counter to the expectations of society. But let me ask you, do you know people by their successes or by their failures? How do people know you? When you just say the name Bill Clinton, do you immediately think Rhodes Scholar who rose from an impoverished home where he had to protect his mother from the violent abuses of an alcoholic stepfather in rural Arkansas, and yet left that home to go to Yale Law School and eventually became the President of the United States? Is that what you think? Or is it all you can think of in association with this president is an inner office affair with an aide? Both are true. It's all true. But somehow rising above a tragically impoverished childhood to go to Yale, to become a Rhodes Scholar, and then to become the President of the United States, those things don't even stand side by side with what we all know of his moral failings. We even know what color dress she was wearing. We know every detail of it. Dan was telling me that getting a tour of the White House, that the Secret Service even pointed out the little kitchenette where the deed happened. We are so focused on that. How did the child of a single mom who had an abusive alcoholic father end up at Yale Law School and end up a Rhodes Scholar? That's a lot more interesting to me than whatever happened in that kitchenette. But it is never mentioned. I continue to believe that a lot of the mess around Clinton's life was not his sexual dalliance, because I don't think that's very uncommon for men in high office, but it was the resentment of blue-blooded Washington that couldn't stand the fact that what they considered to be Arkansas trailer trash had made it into the White House in the first place, and they were going to put a stop to it. Now, I'm not defending what Clinton did. What Clinton did with Monica Lewinsky was wrong. I'm just wondering, given that start in life, how many of his critics could have accomplished 10% of what he accomplished? We get trained to go for the jugular, though, don't we? Especially in an election year. But seriously now, if you were thinking about it and your sister was going to date a politician, would you rather she go out with Bill Clinton or Newt Gingrich? Because they both had affairs. What makes Clinton known for his affair and Gingrich's, which was in many ways more smarmy and hypocritical, why doesn't he get that label? Why don't we think of Gingrich that way? And of course, the woman he was leaving the impeachment hearings in the Congress to go out to a parking garage to have sex with, she became Mrs. Gingrich number 3. And then she was appointed, and gosh, guys, you couldn't make this up. She got appointed to be the ambassador to the Vatican because she's such a good Catholic. Does anything about this seem unfair to you? Does this seem unjust? Callista and Monica did exactly the same thing. Monica becomes a term of derision. Callista becomes the United States ambassador to the Vatican. Clinton gets impeached. Newt later runs for office. He explained his hypocrisy, saying that his affair with Callista gave him moral clarity about why he needed to impeach Clinton. Now, I want you to let that go as fast as you can, because if you think about that too long, your brain will explode. But how are you known? If there's a conversation where your name comes up in a coffee shop, and someone's like, who are you talking about? And the other person's got to describe you in 2 or 3 words. You know that guy who? You know that woman who? Well, what are the words they're going to use to identify you? In the Bible, at least Nicodemus gets a name. The Samaritan woman at the well doesn't even get a name. She just, the one that was married 5 times. Which is 3 times more than I've been married, so obviously I am morally superior to her. I apologize, Sean. It's unfair of me to quote a song that I didn't tell you I was going to quote, but thank you for pulling a rabbit out of a hat last minute and singing it for us. But Leonard Cohn writes this line in the song Anthem. And he's quoting Ralph Waldo Emerson very loosely. Forget your perfect offering. There's a crack. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. You're not perfect. And even if people choose to identify you by your failings, if that's the adjectives that they would choose by shorthand to say, well, that guy that's been divorced X number of times, the guy that went bankrupt, the guy that had the affair, the guy that did this, the guy that got caught stealing money, the guy that did that, got DUI charges, was addicted to heroin, whatever. No matter how they describe you, you need to hear me telling you need to hear John telling you, everything is cracked. Everything. I'm pretty good at psychological diagnosis. I've got one for every one of you. There's a crack in everything. But that's where the light gets in. This is not a historical story about a Martin Luther King Jr. or Dorothy Day. It's not a superhero story about Superman or Wonder Woman. This is a story about broken folk. And in this case, the one who was the most broken, the one who was able to let the light in through the broken places, becomes the hero of the story. You don't come to church for a history lesson. You might get a little history with it, and that's for free, but you don't come here for a history lesson. Like in this Phil Ox song that Sean's about to sing, or Mark, I don't know who's singing. Phil, but okay. It isn't about what Jesus did. It isn't about what was done to Jesus. It's about what you were going to do with the story. Ox concludes, 2,000 years have passed and gone, many a hero too. But the dream of this poor carpenter remains in the hands of you. Remains in the hands of you. We're all getting old, but our lives aren't over. We're not a part of history. There's no stone monument to our memory yet. And even if the people in the coffee shop and some of your own family members and people you used to think were your friends think that they own you because they can gossip about you by some perception of theirs of failures that they have exaggerated in their own minds, we aren't living in their history either. They don't define us and they don't own us. Whatever it was that Jesus set out to do in this world, I got to tell you, he didn't do a very good job of finishing the job. This doesn't look right to me. The world doesn't look finished to me. Truth is, my professors told me a lot about history and theology, and I'm pretty good at both of them. What I'm not good at is figuring out what the hell to do about all this. I don't know what to do. But this is the truth. The dream of this poor carpenter remains in the hands of me and you. It remains in our hands. So we got to figure out what we're going to do to finish what he started. Amen.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.